Medieval history is full of famous weapons, but not all of them came from royal armories or were carried by knights in shining armor. Some of the most important blades belonged to ordinary people, made not for glory, but for survival. Among them was a simple fighting knife that almost no one talks about today. It didn't appear in heroic tales, and no poet ever sang about it, yet this knife shaped daily life in the Middle Ages more than most realize. Number 1. The knife no one talks about. When most people think about medieval combat, the first images that come to mind are knights with shining swords, long lances used in tournaments, or huge axes swung by soldiers in heavy armor. What rarely gets mentioned is the kind of knife that ordinary people, and even common soldiers, carried almost everywhere. This knife was not decorated with jewels, it was not shown off at feasts, and no one wrote romantic songs about it. Yet it played a vital role in the daily life of the Middle Ages, and often decided who survived in a fight. Historians today usually group it with the peasant's messer, or sometimes call it the Bauernwehr, which translates to peasant's defense. In some descriptions, it is also referred to as a ruger, although that word was not used in the medieval period. Whatever name you use, it was the everyday fighting knife that people depended on when things turned violent. Unlike the knightly longsword, which was both a weapon and a symbol of wealth and class, this knife was designed with one goal: practicality. It had no need for fancy engravings or polished guards. The blade was thick, rigid, and often tapered to a point strong enough to punch through heavy clothing or thinner pieces of armor. The handle was simple wood, fixed with rivets, and there was usually only a small guard, if any at all, to stop the hand from slipping forward. It was the kind of weapon you could carry without drawing too much attention, and in a society where danger was never far away, that mattered. Imagine a farmer finishing work in the fields, a knife like this hanging at his belt. During the day, he might use it to cut rope, split kindling, or butcher an animal. But if he had to walk home after sunset along unsafe roads, that same knife became his line of defense against thieves or raiders. Medieval life was never as stable as we often picture it. Roads were dangerous, villages clashed over land, and hunger could turn neighbors into enemies. While the nobles prepared for grand battles, the everyday man had to think about survival in the small but deadly encounters that could happen any time. When fighting broke out, larger weapons often failed quickly. Spears snapped, axes could get stuck, and swords were expensive luxuries. But the peasant's fighting knife stayed reliable. It was short enough to use in a brawl where men grappled face to face, yet strong enough to stab into weak points in armor. Archaeological finds show that these knives were common across Central Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. They appear in graves of working men and in abandoned castles, proof that they were never rare or special, just essential. What makes this knife so overlooked in our modern view of medieval warfare is the lack of glamour. People want to imagine duels between knights with gleaming swords, not a muddy clash where a farmer drives a plane, but deadly knife into his opponent. Yet that is the reality of survival in the Middle Ages. It was not the ornate weapons that kept most men alive, but the simple blades that could be trusted every single day. This is why the medieval fighting knife deserves more recognition. It was not a symbol of status. It was a tool of life and death, carried quietly on the belts of people who understood how unpredictable their world really was. Number 2. The world these knives lived in. To understand how important these blades were, you have to imagine what life was actually like during the late Middle Ages. Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries wasn't a peaceful place. It was divided into small kingdoms, duchies, and city-states that constantly fought one another. Even when there wasn't an official war, violence was never far away. Local feuds, bandit raids, and armed disputes between villages were part of everyday reality. Life for most people wasn't about glory or honor. It was about staying alive and keeping what little they had. In that kind of world, owning a weapon wasn't optional. It was necessary. A knight could afford a sword made by a skilled smith, polished to perfection, but a farmer or craftsman couldn't dream of that. They needed something affordable that worked both as a tool and as protection. That's where the fighting knife came in. It was the kind of blade that could chop firewood in the morning and defend its owner at night. It was reliable, simple, and always close at hand. For many peasants and townsfolk, it was the only weapon they ever had. If you picture a medieval army, you might think of shining armor and lines of trained soldiers. In reality, most of them were ordinary men forced to fight. They carried what they could: axes, small spears, or knives. When the chaos of battle began and formations fell apart, those short knives suddenly became essential. Long weapons were hard to use when men were pressed shoulder to shoulder. But a knife could slip through gaps in armor, or hit the exposed areas under the arm, or between plates. That's why these blades were designed to be sturdy, with strong tips that wouldn't bend or break. Archaeologists today find them everywhere, buried near castles, in village ruins, even hidden inside the walls of old houses. That tells us these knives weren't rare collector's items. They were part of daily life. Some versions show reinforced points, proving they were made with combat in mind. Others were more like working tools that could still be deadly when needed. In places like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, where militias defended towns against raiders, these knives became especially common. Every man needed something he could trust if danger came suddenly. Movies make the life of a knight look exciting, but real knights didn't fight every day. They trained, managed lands, and spent years waiting for battles that might never come. Common soldiers and townsmen lived with violence much more often. They couldn't depend on fancy weapons that took months to forge. They needed blades that worked immediately. That's why this simple fighting knife mattered so much. It was affordable, durable, and effective. When we talk about medieval warfare, it's easy to focus on the great swords and massive pikes displayed in museums. But those weapons belonged to the few. The reality for most people was much simpler and far more practical. Their survival depended on the knife they carried at their belt, the same blade that helped them work during the day and protected them when night brought danger. Number 3. How it was built and used. The construction of these medieval fighting knives was more sophisticated than it might seem at first glance. Most of them had thick, solid blades with a clear taper toward the point. That design gave the weapon balance and strength at the same time. The taper wasn't just for looks. It allowed the knife to drive through tough material while staying rigid enough not to bend or snap. The blades were often forged from high-carbon steel, a material that could hold an edge well but still be sharpened easily in the field. The shape usually narrowed sharply, ending in a sturdy piercing point made specifically for thrusting rather than slicing. This design made sense in close combat, where space was tight and precision mattered more than reach. Some of these knives had small guards, often only on one side, to stop the hand from sliding forward. Others used a simple metal ring near the handle for extra control. They didn't have full cross guards like swords, because that would make them heavy and slow to draw. Speed and reliability mattered more than defense. The handles were almost always made of wood, attached with metal rivets that sometimes went all the way through the tang. These rivets could be hollow to reduce weight. The result was a knife that looked plain but felt balanced in the hand. The overall shape resembled an oversized kitchen knife, and that's not far from the truth. Many medieval craftsmen who made cutlery also produced fighting knives using the same skills. Decoration was rare. At most, a knife might have a small carved line or pattern on the wooden grip. Most were simple because the people who owned them needed them for work, not display. Carrying a sword in town could draw attention or even get you fined, but a knife was part of daily life. In combat, these blades were brutally efficient. Imagine two soldiers locked together, wrestling for control in the dirt and chaos of battle. A sword is too long for that kind of fight, but a short, rigid knife fits perfectly into the gaps of armor or between joints. Historical fighting manuals from Germany and Italy show glimpses of these techniques. Fighters used one hand to grab the enemy's arm or collar while driving the knife forward with the other. One common method was the thumb-on-spine grip, which gave better accuracy for thrusts. It also helped control the blade's direction, especially when targeting weak spots like the armpit or neck. Against unarmored opponents, quick slashes to the face or hands could end a fight instantly. The edge wasn't as sharp as a sword's, but it didn't need to be. It only had to cut through fabric, flesh, or light leather to be effective. These knives blurred the line between weapon and tool. A soldier might use it to prepare food, fix gear, or skin a rabbit, then draw it in self-defense an hour later. That practicality made it one of the most dependable items a person could own. Knights often carried elegant daggers like the rondelle, which symbolized their status as much as their skill. The ruger, or peasant's knife, didn't carry that kind of meaning. It was straightforward and honest in design, focused entirely on doing its job. Modern collectors who handle reproductions are usually surprised at how well balanced and durable these knives feel. They were not crude or primitive. They were carefully engineered for survival. In the rough, unpredictable world of the Middle Ages, when larger weapons failed or were lost, this small and unassuming blade was often the one that decided who walked away alive. Number 4. Why this forgotten knife mattered. The ruger, or what historians would link to the peasant's messer and Bauernwehr, stayed in the shadows because stories favored glitter and ceremony over routine survival. Swords became symbols on banners and in poems, so they soaked up attention long after battles ended. Knives lived quieter lives on belts and workbenches, which meant fewer chroniclers cared to describe them. Yet this unadorned blade answered needs that never went away. It was cheap enough for a farmhand, tough enough for a militiaman, and plain enough to carry through a market without hassle. In crowded fights where men slammed into each other, reach mattered less than control, and a rigid point that found gaps in clothing or armor ended the struggle fast. Outside war, the same knife-cut rope, split kindling, and dressed game, so owners practiced with it without thinking, which made them deadlier when danger came. Finds from village sites and town fortifications show how widespread these knives were, and wear marks tell a story of constant use rather than ceremonial display. That is why the blade deserves attention today. It shows how most people actually lived and fought, not with pageantry, but with practical tools that worked when it counted.